project is dedicated to assisting LGBTQ people in upstate New York achieve their goals of building and sustaining healthy families. Our network of more than 500 Pride and Joy families provides social and educational opportunities and a much-needed sense of community to LGBTQ parents, prospective parents, and their children. The project was founded in April of 2000 with a grant from the New York State Department of Health. And now I'm very, very excited to introduce our speaker for tonight's session, Arlene, Ari, Istar Lev, who is a dear friend, a founding advisory board member of the Lesbian and Gay Family Building Project. Also founder and clinical director of Choices Counseling and Consulting in Albany, New York since 1986. A social worker, family therapist, addictions counselor, and also a gender specialist. Ari is a lecturer at the State University of New York at Albany School of Social Welfare and adjunct faculty at Empire State College. She's also clinical supervisor of the Center Support Counseling at the Pride Center of the Capital District. She's also director for the Institute for Gender, Relationships, Identity, and Sexuality. Welcome, Ari.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm glad to be here, and I'm excited about this conversation we're going to be having tonight. I just wanted to share just a few other things that Claudia did not mention, because I asked her not to, not because she didn't want to. You see on the screen my two books that I have written, one of them on a clinical book on working with transgender clients, and the other one, The Complete Lesbian and Gay Family Guide. And I just wanted people to know that I'm happy to sell my books at a discount. So if anybody who has been taking part in these webinars is interested, you can, later on, you'll see my email address, and you feel free to write me, and I will be happy to do that. The other thing I just wanted to say is we're going to do this a little differently. Whoops. I'll give away my secrets, yeah. Do this a little differently than we did last time. I'm new to doing webinars, and I felt a little bit last time like I was talking into space, and I couldn't get any feedback from you guys. So if you, at any point while I'm talking, if anything is unclear or if you have questions that you want to raise, on your screen you can write the questions out, and there's a little button you can press to raise your hand. And I can't promise you we will get to you immediately, but if I see you and your question there, I would love to get you more involved. So this question, where do babies come from? You know, this is kind of this universal question. All children want to know about their origins. They want to know where they come from. And for some reason, there's a lot of tension about this. There's you know, sort of this joke in our culture about, I don't know how to talk to my children about this. I'm scared to talk to my children about this. So the first thing I want us to think a little bit about is, what are children really asking when they're asking us questions about their origins? If they're asking us questions about pregnancy, if they're asking us where do babies come from, or how do babies get into mommy's bellies, what is it that they're really asking us? And in our culture, we're sort of, we're set up to have the talk, you know, have you talked to your children, as if it is an event, that there's a time you should talk to your children. And I do have to say that I'm often surprised, both as a therapist and as a mom, talking to people, talking to friends of mine, and who will say, well, I have never talked about that. I haven't had the conversation yet, as if it is this one conversation, this single conversation that you're supposed to knock on your child's door and say, tonight we're going to talk about this subject of where you come from. So what are kids asking when they ask questions? Are they asking us about the birds and the bees? And Claudia and I and Heather and I were joking before we started, what is this birds and bees anyway? I've never really quite understood exactly what that means. But, are they asking questions about reproduction? Are they asking questions about their bodies? And the last one I have here is, are they asking questions about love and romance? And I think that these three questions get very mixed up in all of our minds, that the child is really asking a question about how their bodies work or how their bodies function, and we sometimes think they're asking questions about reproduction, or we think they're asking questions about sex and sexuality. And so I think that we really have to be listening more clearly to the question and finding out what it is that kids are actually asking. Okay. All conversations about sex, about where babies come from, about human intimacy, about what their bodies are like, need to take place throughout their lives, not at a specific time. And the conversation sort of matures and grows along with them. So I can appreciate that if you've never talked to your kids about their bodies, if you've never talked to your kids and you've never used the word penis and vagina, if you've never talked to your kids about how babies are made, if you've never had any of those conversations, it surely can be difficult to think you have to sort of squeeze all that into one conversation when the building blocks haven't been set there. And I want to start by really asking everyone to sort of contemplate inside yourselves if these conversations feel awkward to you. I mean, does it feel hard when you imagine or think about your child asking you questions about where they come from or how they got here? Is it awkward for you? And I'm just thinking about a number of years ago, I was at a kid's birthday party, and I noticed that one of the girls that my kids had played with since they were little was starting to develop. And I said, casually to the mom, like, oh, your little girl's growing up. And she got so incredibly uncomfortable and said, I just can't talk to her even about getting a bra. So if we're uncomfortable about these conversations, to really look at why is it that we're uncomfortable. Many of you have probably heard people say, don't give them more information than they're asking. In other words, just answer the question. And I want to challenge that a little bit, because I don't think that it's good for us to hold back information. I think it's more useful to use these as opportunities to talk to children about, if you will, more. So, by the time you think that kids are ready for information, I actually want to suggest that it's already too late. And too late should probably be in quotes. Of course, it's never too late to learn things. But kids are have times in their lives as they mature where they're less willing to talk with their parents. They're less willing, I speak as the mother of a 16-and-a-half-year-old, they're less willing to listen to parents. And the windows of time that you have to sort of download information gets shorter and shorter. And the world, their social world, their friendship world, their Facebook world, their school worlds take up more and more time, and we lose our status as experts. And that's, all developmentally appropriate. It's exactly the way it should be. However, it means that oftentimes we're waiting to tell them information about their lives when it's really past the point when they're going to be the most open to hearing it. Okay, so on your screen you see this this Venn diagram, and I'm queer for Venn diagrams. I just love Venn diagrams. So we have this Venn diagram that has family forms, history of the family, and age of the child. And these three items, I think, are the intersecting issues that impact this conversation of how do we talk to kids about their origins and how they got here. So I'm going to break them up into different parts. So the first question is, what is your family form? Are you a single parent raising a child or children? Is it a couple? And I want to, we keep flashing around this term LGBT these days, and I'm just a little uncomfortable with it because I think it melds together four different potential family forms that are in many ways very, very different. So when it says couple here, it's really four bullet marks here. It could be lesbian couples, gay male couples, transgender and bisexual couples, and I want to break that down because, of course, it couldn't be a bisexual person involved in a same-sex or opposite-sex relationship, and it could be a trans person. We'll talk more about this on, in many different identities of what that means to be trans. So, even in coupleness, we're really talking about a lot of diverse kinds of families. Divorced families, and this could be families that were formed in a heterosexual marriage that have divorced, and now one or both of the homes are LGBT. And it also can be in a gay or lesbian couple who breaks up and potentially goes on to make other families. So each of these different families is going to be different kinds of issues that the children are going to be bringing when they're asking this question about their origins. So families formed by remarriage and step-parenting, and again, LGBT or straight. Children and families formed by adoption, and children and families formed by adoption where the kids were older. And again, those bring up different kinds of issues about family formation. Obviously, in families where the children were adopted at older ages, they may have very clear memories of their birth families. Some of those memories may be painful. There may be loss involved. There may be sadness involved. There may be difficulty bonding with their second family, which is, again, going to bring up different kinds of questions for them about their origins. I don't think very many people anymore who adopt children at birth don't tell their children. Of course, that was an older model we used 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I have occasionally met people who have come to see me again, in clinical settings, who have never told the children. They've never begun that process. So they adopted their child at birth, and now the child is 9 or 10 years old, and they've never introduced a subject about adoption. So now it's an awkward conversation to be talking about how shall they tell the children. So children in families formed by donor insemination, children in families formed by surrogacy, and children in families formed by using all kinds of reproductive technologies. These last three kinds of families, donor, family, surrogacy, and reproductive technologies, are families that have thought long and hard. I mean, one doesn't just, you can't just get knocked up surrogacy-wise. I mean, it has to be immensely planned, and it's financially expensive, and there's all kinds of questions with donor insemination about timing. So often, lots and lots of time has gone into thinking about how do we get our children. Perhaps not as much time has gone into thinking about how do we talk to our children. So also, children in families with bisexual parents, and I want to stress what I said before, that there are bisexual parents who appear to be in lesbian and gay relationships, and there are bisexual parents who appear to be in heterosexual relationships. And raising kind of questions about how do we talk to kids about bisexuality in our families. I actually don't know that I've ever seen anything written on that subject before. Children in families with trans parents, and this can mean a family where a parent has transitioned from male to female or female to male, identifies as transsexual or identifies as post-transsexual, and it could mean that that change happened during the child's life, or it could mean that it happened 10 years before the child was conceived. And then people who identify as trans or transgender or genderqueer, who are somewhere on the spectrum of exploring, expressing gender identity in a non-traditionally normative way, and often ways that may be noticeable and public. So it raises not only questions for the form of the family, but how does the child talk with other people about their family. Families that include non-biological parents, and by that I mean like a lesbian couple where they've had a child through donor insemination, but one of the couple is not biologically related to the child. And again, biology is a very difficult concept for kids to understand. So that can be a really difficult piece to try to explain to a child that you belong to both of us. And this is even more complex. I know we have people on the phone that are not from New York and not from the Northeast who live in states where one cannot legally adopt a child that the other parent gave birth to. So helping children to understand this complex thing that we are both your parents, but one of us does not have legal rights to the child. And I also was thinking about families that include biological, quote-unquote, non-family members. And I know in our family, both of my boys are adopted. We have relationships with their biological families, but I wouldn't quite call them family. Maybe they're extended family, maybe they're like family, but they're certainly not part of our nuclear family. And we only really have contact with them once a year, maybe once every other year. So there are lots of people in our lives that are much closer to them than their biological family. But it's a kind of an odd relationship where it's family and not family at the same time. So we also have children from out LGBT homes and children that are in more closeted homes. And I put that in quotations because I don't just mean closeted as in nobody knows, but I mean some of us are living in parts of the country where it is more difficult to be out. So children are having to manage stories about their family and explanations about their mother's partner, or about their origins, or how did your dads have a baby together, in environments where it's not completely able to just simply tell the truth. And some of our families, of course, are formed in multiple methods, meaning that we adopted our older child, we had our second child through donor insemination, and then we had, 5-6 years later, we adopted 2 older kids in our family. So it's not like every child's story is the same. So we're looking at a really diverse group of children in lots of different kinds of families, and how can I possibly, in an hour, address in great depth each of those differences. So I'm going to try to, but you appreciate, I think, the problem with that. Let me see if anybody's hand is up. Okay, nobody's hand is up. So the other question is the history of the family. How did this particular family come into being? So was our family planned? So like I said earlier, children who come from donor insemination, from surrogacy, it is not just planned. I always say, the most planned families. And I think that LGBT people in general plan our families with greater thought than many, many heterosexual people who have the ability to simply get pregnant. So how was the family planned? Was our family accidental? And some of our families are accidental. I know of one family where a gay man was the emergency contact was if something happened to his sister, who was perfectly healthy, and her and her husband were perfectly healthy, and there was a car accident and the parents accidentally died, and suddenly he inherited a child that he never really thought he was going to be a full-time parent, and there he was being a full-time parent. Some of us fall in love with people that have children, and we become a step parent, although perhaps we were not necessarily planning that. The issue of coming out, some of us came out 30 years before we had children, and some of us have come out after our children are with us, and then raising, again, questions that they are having to explain this change in their lives. And the issue of explaining children's previous history, if they have been adopted or fostered. How are the children able to talk about that? Do they want to talk about that? I remember once I was walking, I was at an amusement park, and I was taking a little boy to the bathroom who was part of our extended crowd that we were hanging out with, and he was about 5 or 6 years old and had been adopted by his parents, and we were walking to the bathroom, and it was very crowded, and I said, would you hold my hand so you don't get separated from me? And he said, out of the blue, I was separated, from my birth mom. I was taken away from her. And I loved that he was able, to sort of engage in this very deep conversation, and obviously to me that said that this had been something that was talked about in the family he was living in, but sometimes people's previous histories get silenced. And all kinds of questions about race and ethnicity, of who looks like who in the family. You know, in my family, I have had people who assume that my younger son was birthed by my partner, and people who assume that my younger son was birthed by me. And I've had people say that he looks like her and that he looks like me, when in truth he was adopted, and I guess he looks like both of us, sort of. But, you know, that whole question of who do you belong to, who in this family looks like whom, and what role does that play in the family. And questions of ability and disability in a family, which again becomes part of what is the conversation about our family in terms of how our family is made up. So questions of disability from a parent who may be disabled, but also children who are disabled. So questions that kids get, you know, about their siblings can also come up here. So again, siblings, a mix of adoption and donor, how old were people when they were adopted, and questions of step parenting. You know, I fall in love with somebody who's got children, and I have children, and now we have this sort of mixed Brady Bunch family of children who have all these different origins. And one of the questions I think a lot about in our families is the quote-unquote missing parent. And what I mean by this is our children often get, you know, where's your daddy? What do you mean you don't have a daddy? Everybody has a daddy. And it's great pressure on a child to be saying, I don't have a daddy. You know, I know what I have. I don't have a daddy. I know there's a story that floats around the community of a little girl who was on an airplane, and somebody said, you know, which one of these women is your mother, or something like that. And she said, they both are. And the woman said, oh, come on. Everybody knows you can't have two mothers. And she's like, you know, like the kid was like 5 or something, and was like, you know, what is your problem? Like, of course I have two mothers. So, you know, when children are being raised in a family, they often have a clear sense of who they are versus sort of coming into a family. When you're older, it can be a little bit more complicated. But our families have this missing parent, and that sometimes outside people see this as a loss or a sadness that we have to help them manage. Wanting to know their donor, wanting to know their birth mother in a closed adoption, sometimes divorces where one of the parents leaves or is gone. Our religious communities, you know, how have they reacted to our families, our lesbian, gay, queer identities, our adoption status? Have they been welcoming? Have they been rejecting? And how does that piece play into our understanding of ourselves? For people for whom religion has been a very important part of their lives, this can be a real crisis, being rejected by families. Where we live. How accepting is it where we are? I was once talking to a woman who was from San Francisco, and she had 2 children, and we were talking about daycares at the time. My kids were young, and she said, you know, I'm just so tired of hearing people talk about, you know, how hard it is to come out in daycare. Like, it's just no big deal. And I was just looking at her, and I was like, you live in San Francisco. Like, I live in Albany, New York. It's really a big deal. And I suspect that some of you that are on the phone from Mississippi or Alabama, it's a really, really, really big deal trying to explain our families. I remember the little boy who said to me when he said, I don't understand what you are. And I said, we're a family. We're 2 moms, and these are our 2 children. And he looked at me and he said, oh, I read about that. You know, so sometimes our families are really odd to other people. And what is our legal status to one another? How safe are we in that? Okay, the last part of my Venn diagram, the age of the child. You know, everything is a developmental process. This whole idea of what the child is able to understand at different stages of life. So, you know, we want to start when they're young, giving them information, and we're going to sort of build or grow that information. But it's not just about age. It's also about the cognitive abilities of a particular child. So some of that might be disability related, kids with ADD, kids with developmental disabilities, who their ability to understand the information is going to be impacted, is going to be influenced. So we don't want to complicate stuff for them at the same time that we want to be honest with them and talk with them. But sometimes kids' cognitive development, their intellectual development, and the kind of kid they are, how they emotionally react to things. There are kids that just kind of, you were adopted and they're like, okay, cool. And there are kids for whom this causes a tremendous emotional reaction. We have a child in our extended family who was adopted, as a very, very young baby and is in a very loving family, but struggles around being adopted in such incredibly deep ways. And this is not because her parents have done anything wrong in how they brought all those issues up. It's just really hard for her. And for other kids, it's just not such a big deal. So the cognitive skill of the child, the emotional ability of the child is going to impact what we can say and how we can say it and when we can say it and at what ages. So there might be kids that can absorb information at age 5 that other kids may not be 10 or 11 before we can talk to them about that. So the question of what can this individual child really understand, how much do they comprehend what's going on, and also it's I think it's one thing to talk about donor insemination, and it's a whole other complex thing to talk about surrogacy, which is much more technologically and biologically complicated. I know lots of adults that are not 100% sure, don't even know how surrogacy works. Okay, and is the child asking questions? Sorry if that's making noise. My headphone was slipping. Is the child asking? There are kids that come to us and they're asking very direct questions and they want to understand things. And there are other kids that don't want to talk, don't want to have the conversation, that even if we try to have the conversation, they're kind of shutting us down a little bit. So all of these, development, cognitive abilities, emotional abilities, and is the child asking questions, all impact one another. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down the rest of this conversation into different ages. So very young children are in some ways the easiest because they really need very little information. Certainly if you look at these two little kids in this picture over here, I don't think they really need to understand how surrogacy works. What little kids need to know is who's in my family. They need to know about relationships. They're not going to question it. If you say, I'm your mommy or I'm your daddy, they're just going to be like, okay, that's cool. They don't have any context to question that. But what they often want to know is who is in their family and how the people in their families interact with one another. Maybe some of you have had the experience with little kids where they'll say things to you like, when you and Grandma were little, and you say, no, Grandma and I were not little at the same time. Grandma is much older than me. I was little, and Grandma was my mommy. They look at you like you're crazy. Like they can't even, until they're 4 or 5 years old, they just can't even figure out what it is you're talking because the world is really seen from their perspective. That's how they see that. So you guys are grown-ups. You all grew up together, and you're all, I'm in the center of this narcissistically. It's all around me. So how does each of these people relate to me? They have no preconceived ideas about families or how families, quote unquote, should be. And I think that's a really important thing for us all to remember. There's a sense that we have of how am I going to tell my kid about 2 mommies? Well, for all your kid knows, everybody has 2 mommies. They're not born with an understanding of what a family should look like. That information gets socialized into them as they start watching television and they go to school and they begin to hear mommy, daddy, mommy, daddy, mommy, daddy. They begin to get a sense that they're supposed to, or that most kids have a mommy and daddy, but they do not initially have that idea. So all children, and I want to really stress this, that I'm not just talking about the children of LGBT people, all children need to be taught about diversity. Some families have 1 mom and some families have 2. Some families have one dad, and some families have two. Some kids have a mom and a dad. Some kids have a mom and a grandma. Some kids have siblings. Some kids don't have siblings. That they need to be taught that from the youngest ages, that all families look different. And if everybody's working really hard on that, then it sort of becomes easier, because, again, it's all about that bullet point earlier about relationships. Who is in your family becomes the question. I also want to say that silence is not okay. So even though the kids are really little and they're not understanding all of the depth of what we're talking about, not talking about the differences, not noting, you know, our friend Sally has a mom and a dad and you have two moms, that not silencing those questions but beginning to introduce the concepts and the ideas. So, you know, we have a lot of books now that show more diverse families, which is just wonderful. And we need to be helping our children. We need to point this out to our children when they're very little, of recognizing differences in families. Okay. Remember that you are the one determining the language that the child will use. So if you use the word daddy, they'll use the word daddy. If you use the word birth mom, they'll use the word birth mom. If you use the word real mom, they'll use the word real mom. So they are absolutely, when they are little, 100% dependent on us to give them the language that they will use to describe your family. And I think that that is truly the greatest power that we have. And to hear kids use those terms back to us, the terms that we're giving them to describe their world. However, the words that we are giving them have potentially different meanings outside of the family. So again, if you say that you were created by your moms wanted to have a baby and we used a donor, and the child will think of that person, the donor, in a very different way than if you're using the term daddy. If you say we needed a seed from a man, they will think of that in a very different context than they will think of their friend's daddy. If you use the word daddy, we got sperm from your daddy, then they'll want to know, well, how come my friend is hanging out with their daddy and I've never met my daddy? So we have to be really careful with language here. And remember that children love stories about themselves. They love hearing that. So, to create their birth story, their coming home story if they were adopted, the story about how, both of us daddies, thought about wanting to have a child, and, you were, I don't know what word you use for the surrogate, but whatever, whether she has a name or whether she says your birth mommy, we chose to do it in this very particular way, and the first time we saw you, that there's a story. And some people, with adoption have actual books that they put together to outline the child's adoption story. This is when I first met your birth mom, and this is when I first saw your face. And so we can create that story for our children. And when they're very little, they'll ask for the story over and over again. If we have pictures, they'll want to see those pictures. When children are between 5 and 10 years old, their ability to start understanding is, okay, I have no hands being raised. All right. So when children are between 5 and 10 years old, they start noticing differences. They recognize that other families look different from their families, and they start to compare. They start to say, my friend has a larger bedroom than I do, or my other friend shares a bedroom with her sister. They start to notice that family does things different. And again, they start asking questions. So it's really important to check what is it they're asking, what is it they really want to know. So I'm going to tell a story here that I was sitting in a restaurant once with my younger son. He was about 5, maybe 6 years old at the time. And it happened to be that I could see through the reflection in the window from where we were sitting what he was seeing. And I saw that outside of the restaurant there was a dad who was sort of picking his kid up and twirling his kid around. And suddenly my son said to me, sorry about that, my son said to me, I really want to have a daddy. Now, if I had not been able to see what was happening in the reflection, I would have probably taken that to be this sort of deep and perhaps solemn moment of, oh my God, why is he wanting a daddy? But because I could see that, I looked at him and I said, it would be really nice to have somebody who could pick you up and toss you around, wouldn't it? And his eyes got really big like I was some kind of psychic, and said, yes, 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 that's what I want. I want somebody who'd pick me up. And, instead of having that, he has 2 older moms with bad backs, and he was not going to get that in this family. And I said, how about if we go over to our friend's house? I'm sure his dad will be really happy to pick you up and do that. Oh, can we do that? So this wasn't a deep issue at that moment about his origins or his missing father. This was simply a question of wanting to be tossed up in the air and having a mom who couldn't do that. So it's also important that kids at this age don't really understand the politics of our families. They don't get why gay families are good or gay families are bad, or why they have no ability. It may be, starting at 10 or 11 or 12, but little kids have no ability. They just want to be normal. They want their family to be like other families. So if they're resisting that, if they're saying, I don't want to have 2 moms, it's often not because they have a judgment of homosexuality. It's because they're not seeing that reflected around them. And remember that the biggest question for kids in this age group is just simply, how does this impact me? Because everything about this age group is about just a narcissistic sense of me. I knew somebody who was transgender and in the process of transitioning, and said to the 5-year-old little boy that Daddy was going to be living as a female, as a woman, and wanted to know how he felt about that. And the little boy sat very thoughtful, and then he said, I just want to know, are you going to still watch monster trucks on TV with me? So these huge questions of what does it mean to have a quote-unquote sex change, or what does it mean to be transgender, it really wasn't about that. It's what's going to change in my relationship with you, and if you're willing to watch monster trucks with me, I don't really care about the rest of it. So we need to be talking openly at this age, 5 through 10, about differences. All kinds of differences, about race, about color, about physical features in our families, about abilities and disabilities, about noticing differences in people. And remember that to a large extent you're modeling reactions and comfort, that they're looking to you to see how are you acting about this issue, how are you feeling about this issue. And if they're asking you a question about their adoption, or they're asking you a question about their disability, and they're noticing that you're feeling uncomfortable, that will affect their reactions more than anything else. And we need to also help them find words to talk about their families with their peers and their teachers and outsiders, not just around bullies, not just, responses to, the bully who says, your family is not okay, and the kid is saying, leave my family alone, but to actually describe their families. That when somebody says, when a teacher says, your mom and dad, for them to have the skills to be able to say, I actually have 2 moms. So we have to give them these words to describe their families to others. And also remember, as kids are getting older, they're going to stop telling us everything, and this will only increase. They want to handle it in their own way. So sometimes we will find out things that happen, and it may be easy for us to want to jump on it, like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened, I need to go talk to your teacher, or I can't believe that person said this to you. And we really need to pull back and find out how the kid handled it and support the kid in handling it as best as he or she could have in that situation, and not sort of jump in to save them, because, really and truly most of their lives they're going to be having to explain this without us being there. So then we have tweens. Tweens being very conscious of the outside world. And when you're a tween, difference is very dangerous. Being a different kid is not something in general, and there are a few exceptions to that, that is going to be taken well. Tweens can be very intense about family issues, whether we're talking about adoption, whether we're talking about gay or lesbian parents, whether we're talking about gender issues in families. Sorry, I needed to take a drink there. So their intensity can be in all kinds of ways. And part of it is just the age. So they can be fiercely supportive of their gay families. They can be very embarrassed of their gay families. At this age, they start being just embarrassed of you all the time for everything. You know, I walk up to a person in the store and I say, excuse me, you know, where are the shoes? And, you know, my tweens just, oh my God, Mom, that was so embarrassing. It's like, you know, what did I do? So you have to remember that kids that are adopted, kids that have gay parents, they might focus in on that, where a kid in another family is going to focus in on something else. So you have to kind of take it a little bit with a grain of salt. So the opposite of the very intense kid are the kids that are very casual. They're very casual. They're very cool. It's no big deal. And I definitely have one kid like that. That is, you know, just this whole subject of this gay parent stuff is so boring, Mom. I just don't know why you want to talk about it. Okay, then there's teens. So the most important thing with teens is you still need to keep talking, although probably they've stopped talking. The conversation starts to mature. Kids who are teens are able to understand about surrogacy. They're able to have sophisticated understandings about adoption, their own adoption history, their friends' families. They sometimes ask very personal questions about our sex lives, personal questions about how we felt about them when they were babies. And we need to be thinking a little bit about how deep we want to be answering some of those questions about what parts of their story are our personal story and what parts of their story are for their ears. They often will avoid talking with their parents. And most importantly, they're beginning to develop their own sexuality, their own gender identity. And there's nothing that's probably more frightening for the children of LGBT parents to think that they might be LGBT or T themselves. No kid really wants to be like their parents, or I should say most kids don't want to be like their parents. So that concern that, oh my, you know, whatever concern people do go through of, oh my God, I might be gay, is going to be exaggerated for these kids. So in some ways, in some families, you might be the last person that they talk to about their sexuality, even though you might think, of course, I'm going to be the easiest and best person to talk to. It may not feel that way to them. Okay, so we have this complex interaction of each of these groups, this family forms, the history of the family, and the age of the child. And obviously, each of these families are very, very different. I wrote here a gay dad formed by adoption of an infant is very different from a single dad or a couple using surrogacy, or a trans dad and his male partner adopting an older sibling group. All of our families are really, really different. So all of our families have this intersectionality. We fit somewhere on this family form, history, and age of child, but the actual forms it's going to take are going to be very different. So I'm going to say some general truths, some general things to be aware of. It's always good to talk and communicate, to not assume that our children know things. And I'm going to share here a story that happened in my family that I'm still sort of reeling from almost 10 years later after it happened. And my son was talking about school, and he said that kind of a thing kind of no parent sort of wants to hear all of a sudden. He said, you know, well, I never tell people at school that you're gay. And I, you know, oh my God, why not? And it was kind of an odd thing because he went to a very small school where everybody knew we were gay. Everyone at the school knew us. And I said, honey, everybody knows you have two moms. And he says, yes, but they don't know that you're gay. And it was like, oh my God, like everybody knows that if you have two moms, that makes your mom gay. And I realized for the first time that that's not necessarily true. That in that sort of way that he knew he had a different kind of family, he wasn't really connecting what it means to be gay, or even in some instances, they don't really know what it is to be gay. I had a conversation with my other son at one point where I realized that he thought gay meant that was a way of describing our family because we're a family with multiple races in our family. And he didn't understand that gay was about a whole other thing. And so, you know, don't assume that children know what the words mean. I worked with a family a number of years ago where the kid had asked the mom, said, you know, I don't know how to, I have a friend that keeps asking me at school, how come you have two moms? And the mom's answer was, you tell your friend it's none of their business. So I want to be really clear that that's not a good answer. I don't think that's a healthy answer for kids. It may be true that it's none of their business, but kids need a more sophisticated way of dealing with their social world. So what exactly does gay mean? And do not wait for them to ask unless they are strongly resistant. You want to make these conversations part of their lives. You want to find opportunities and reasons in the grocery store, over dinner, while you're putting pajamas on, to integrate, and again, I'm not saying overwhelm, I'm not saying do this every day, conversations in their lives where you're talking about their family and different kinds of families. So this is a line from my older son. Please don't ask me again how the kids treat me because I have two moms. Because I probably did ask that question a lot, and his answer was always the same. Everything's cool, Mom. Leave me alone. But I want to be clear that I don't think he's right. In other words, I think it's fine that I kept asking, and I think it's fine that he kept saying, it's cool, leave me alone. I think the alternative, which is I wasn't asking and maybe wasn't finding out that things weren't so cool, would have been much, much, much worse. So it's also important that there's no right or wrong way to develop our families. Now, again, you know, we know this, but, you know, whether adoptions are open or closed, whether our donors are known or unknown, whether our families are signed onto the donor registry or not, whether our donors are dads or just semen, whether we use donor eggs or have biological mothers, that it doesn't matter how our families are formed. Our families are formed in lots of different ways, and you know, things may work for your family that are not the way I want things in my family. That's okay. What has to be true is that however it is in our families, that there is a clarity and consistency of language that we stick with. So in other words, if my family uses the term donor, we shouldn't suddenly start calling donors daddies, because that gets very confusing for children. And you have to really understand that just because you have a story in your family does not mean, okay, I'm looking at I see a little note here. Oh, there's questions here that I missed before, so I'll go back to those in just a second. Let me just finish what I was just saying, which is that, what just happened to the screen? Is your screen as messed up as mine? So the last point on the screen was to understand that they will hear other stories. That you may be very clear that they don't have a daddy, and that doesn't mean that other kids in school won't ask them about their daddy. Other kids in school won't say, do you not miss having a daddy? And that somebody might, they're talking to, particularly if they're hanging out with other kids of LGBT families, they may really get that other kids have donors who they refer to as daddies. So they're going to be getting different stories, and you need to be prepared that your children may start to see their own story differently. Okay. Okay. Oh, so I guess the only question here had to do with the PowerPoint. All right. I'm going to move along then. We'll tell you about that later. So it's also important to remember that although our queer families are very unique in lots of ways, lots of other families are dealing with adoption, lots of other families are dealing with surrogacy, lots of other families are dealing with donors. I've had numerous families come to see me who are not LGBT or T in any way at all, who were heterosexual couples where the child was conceived through donor insemination, and they were not sure how to talk to the child about that. So, it's also really important for us to remember that as unique as we are, we're not as unique as we often think we are, that lots of families are dealing with differences. The research these days is showing that only about a quarter of all families are the mom, dad, 2 kids, and the dog with the white picket fence. About a quarter of people live singly these days, and the statistics on, step families and there's just a great diversity in families in America today. Biracial and transracial biracial couples and transracial adoption, divorce, remarries, etc. So you want to honor the differences in our families, but on the same token, you don't want to highlight them. You don't want to make it so that we are so different that, that you know, as if everybody else is sort of whitewashed the same and we are the different ones. What you want to do is highlight that all families are really different. Okay. So it's also important to remember that children really remember very little from their early years. One of the takeaways from that is don't even bother taking your kids to Disney World until they're at least 8 years old because they won't remember it. But seriously, kids really remember very, very little from their early years. And oddly enough, what happens is we often stop talking about these issues as kids mature. So we may have had lots of conversations about our two daddies in our family when the kids were 2 and 4 and 6. But suddenly by the time the kid is 8 or 9 or 12, we're talking a lot more about soccer, and we're talking a lot more about grades, and we're talking a lot more about don't drink so much soda because it's not healthy for you. But we're really not having these conversations because our kids are relatively integrated into our families. But that's when we need to be talking, and we need to be talking more. And also their thoughts and feelings will continue to change. The kid who was really comfortable with adoption at 5 might not be so comfortable at 13 and might be having a whole new slew of feelings about that. Okay. Checking my time. Doing fine. So as children grow, they become increasingly more protective of their private selves. They don't really want to be talking with parents about lots of things, but about their origins. And they also become increasingly more protective of us, and that's something to remember, that as the children of LGBT people, they often want to, they know that we will be upset or hurt if kids are making fun of them in school. They know that many of us, will sort of respond as activists, so that if the kids are getting picked on in school, they know that we'll go up to the principal and we'll raise holy terror at their school and insist that someone institute an anti-bullying campaign or something. And they don't often want that. They start to protect us from getting hurt. They start to not share things. And lots of parents tell the story that, you know, they didn't know their kids were getting bullied in middle school until their kids were in college, because they just didn't feel like they wanted to tell us, both in part to protect them and in part to protect us. As children grow, they become exposed to more views outside the family. And they begin to understand that people have opinions about adoption, that people have lots of opinions about transracial adoption, that people have strong opinions about gay parents. You know, and you know, there's some little article in the corner, should homosexual partners be able to adopt? You know, they start, you know, our kids are reading at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and they're seeing this. They're seeing Time magazine and Newsweek magazine. They're seeing articles on the table, you know, from the New York Times. They're seeing, you know, kids are on the internet. They're seeing YouTube videos, and these messages of, you know, are gay parents okay? You know, what are we going to do about gay marriage? They're seeing this, and they're beginning to understand and think about all these different ways that outsiders are viewing their families. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit here. So I shared with you I want a daddy story. How do I explain why my parents look so weird? You know, for those of us that are raising kids and families, that some of us may be multiply tattooed or very butch moms, or, you know, that the kids are, again, they may be just fine with us when they're 3 and 4 and 5, but suddenly in middle school, they're beginning to get a little embarrassed about us. So they're trying to make sense of their world. Oh, what is going on? We're going backwards. Don't ever go backwards. Okay. I remember my son said to me once in the car in this very deep, thoughtful voice, have you ever thought about the fact that if I hadn't, that's supposed to be hadn't been adopted, oh no, sorry, if I had been adopted into a different family, I'd be a totally different person. Now, you know, the truth is I, of course, had thought quite a bit about this. I really had. I thought about this a lot. But it was the first time that it really struck him that he could have had a different story, that his story could have had a different ending or a different process. And I think especially for those of us that have children in families that have been adopted, that this idea that the recognizing of how their adoptive parents have molded them in certain ways, and what it would be like. I'd have a different name, wouldn't I? So that becomes part of this process about the origins of their families. So our kids are trying to make sense of the world. They may view, and we can put a lot of things in this blank here, they can view their biological parents, their origins, their means of reproduction, donor insemination or surrogacy, our divorce, our separation, their sister's adoption. They may view all of this very differently than you do, very differently than you want them to. You may have raised your children in a family that you've always said to them, you know, we don't have daddies, we have two mommies, and then you have a 14-year-old who's saying, I don't feel that way about my donor. I want to meet my donor. I feel like he is my daddy. So whatever we do, whatever it is that we do to create our families and send certain messages to, I mean, you know, if everyone just stops for 1 second and thinks about it, very few of us listening here are the way our parents thought we would be. So our kids are going to develop their own sense of the world, and biology may be very important to them, even though it wasn't important to us, or it may not be any important to them at all, even though you worked so hard to make sure you had a known donor. And being queer may be less important to them than it is to us. You know, that we have spent a lot of time being concerned about how the world treats our families and our children, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be. We should be concerned. But they're going to reap the benefits of that, and they might just shrug their shoulders and say, who cares? Who cares about that? But they will absolutely see our families differently than we do. So if you haven't thought much about that, I suggest you put your seatbelt on, because they're going to tell you about how they see the world in very different ways. I'll share a story that when my son was probably about 10 or 11 years old, something came up on the news that had to do with abortion. And he said to me, what's abortion? And of course I was like, haven't we talked about that before? Hadn't I mentioned that? Thought I had, but whether I had or I hadn't, he did not know what that word meant. And I started trying to explain, you know, in very simple terms what an abortion is. And he looked shocked. I mean, he looked so devastated. And I, you know, being a long-term feminist here and pro-choice, I was like, what is going on? And I looked at him and I said, you know, what is it? And he said, if my birth mom had had an abortion, I wouldn't be here. And that hit me so deeply, of understanding that his relationship to that concept was going to be, because he was adopted, so different than mine was. Now, you know, 3 or 4 years later, lots of conversations with his friends. He's a pretty pro-choice guy today. But his initial sense of that, of what these things mean, was so different than I could even have thought of. So they're on the internet. Our kids have access to the donor registry, legally or otherwise. They have access to their birth families through search engines. So, you know, who knows what they're doing on the internet? I know you all like to think you do know what your kids are doing, but I assure you that they're doing things you don't know about. They have access to blogs about gay families, about transracial adoption, about queer identity, that may present very different views than the ones that we've given them. I know a friend of mine, her kid, who had always been very comfortable, you know, she always was very comfortable being adopted, had gotten onto a blog where somebody was ranting and raving about how transracial adoption should not be allowed, and how people were being robbed of their birth families and robbed of their racial heritage. And, you know, concepts probably many of us here have thought about in depth and had conversations about. But this was new to this kid. And he was suddenly furious. He was furious at them for adopting him, and, you know, just ranting and raving about it. It took them a long time as a family to work through this new level. So our kids are going to be exposed. And remember that they're also not always telling us what they're reading or they're watching. So suddenly your kid kind of shuts down and gets weird, and you don't know what's going on sometimes for 6 months. So I want to encourage people to keep talking about families, keep talking about adoption, keep talking about reproductive technologies, talk about race, talk about culture, even when they seem to not be listening, even when they know it all. I just was talking to my almost 12-year-old. I said, you know, there was a book in his room about where babies come from, and I said, you know, we should look at that book again. And he said, there's no reason to look at that because I just know everything. So I started to ask him some challenging questions about fallopian tubes, and it was pretty clear. He didn't quite know everything there was to know yet. Even when they seem annoyed, keep talking. Now, again, I'm not saying drive your kids crazy, but I am saying don't let the conversation drop. Another way I think to do this is to talk to other adults when they seem to be around but not listening. So, you know, you can have conversations with grown-ups over coffee when your kids are in the house, when your kids are in the room. They are listening even when they're pretending not to. It's really good to talk with kids on long car rides. That's a time when kids seem to have, especially teenagers, you can get better attention from them because you don't have eye contact. And in general, don't rant about homophobia and transphobia because it kind of freaks them out. So don't do that. But listen. Listen really hard to what they're saying and try really hard to not, and I find this really hard, you know, they're just so often, if you'll forgive me, just kind of wrong. You know, they're just kind of saying things that aren't quite reality or whatever. And, you know, it's just so easy to want to say, that is so wrong, and, you know, listen to this, and I know, and I'm the one who has the right answers. And it's challenging to, again, really listen to their realities about this. Checking one more time. Okay. Okay. Almost ready to start taking some questions. Remember that they really, really see the world differently than you do. So as much as we will be talking to them about their origins and the decisions that we made to create families in the ways that we created them, and we hope that they feel good about themselves and proud to be part of our families, they will have their own interpretations of what all of this means. And we really need to be extremely, extremely sensitive and open to listening to their version of reality. Okay, so that is what I had to say. And checking the time, I'm exactly on time. So does anybody out there? Is anybody out there? Does anybody have any questions?
As Ari said previously, you can either type in your question or you may raise your hand and I can call on you if you have the ability to speak with a VoIP headset and microphone.
And I don't know that we've talked about what we're going to do if nobody has any questions.
Okay, the first question is, how might you suggest introducing the idea of donor siblings?
That's a good question. Well, I think, again, earlier is better than later, and I don't mean, you know, when the kid is still in diapers. But I think when we're talking, I assume when you're talking about donors, we're talking more about unknown donors versus known donors, because that's kind of usually a different question. Usually known donors have not made tons of donor siblings out there in the world that you don't know. So as you're talking about donors and you're talking about semen, you would be talking about sperm banks and where they come from, and would introduce the idea that generally donors donate for many families. That's where I would start with. So I would start introducing the ideas. And, you know, kids will pick that up. They'll say, wait, what do you mean by that? And to say that, well, there's a good chance that, you know, this nice man who donated semen for us might have had other families that used that semen and had babies. The question of whether or not you want to view that as a sibling or not, I mean, obviously, biologically, there's a sibling connection, but whether or not you want to use the term sibling or use the term sister and brother or use the word biological siblings, again, that's going to vary from family to family, but I really want to encourage people to think very carefully about how you want to present that information to your kids, and also remember that the kid might see that very differently. So the kid, you know, the only child who grew up and finds out, oh my, I have, you know, 10 biological siblings, may be very curious about meeting that sibling and may not be exactly what you wanted.
Okay, the next question is, what would you suggest to beginning therapists and working with the LGBTQ parents or families who may be struggling with internalized homophobia? So,
and if the person who wrote that wants to clarify any of these, you can just type that in and I'll be able to see it. So are you talking about families that are coming to the therapist and thinking that their families are not, quote unquote, good enough because they're queer? So the parents are worried, you know, should two moms have a child? Is the child going to get mothered enough if there's only daddies in the family? So if those are the kinds of concerns that, I'm assuming that's what the person means. So,
yes, the asker has confirmed that that's what she's asking.
Okay. So then the question becomes of talking a little bit about the diversity of families out there. So are two dads worse off than, you know, the single mom down the road? What about the kid who's living with the grandparents? And I don't mean that in a negative way, like, you know, comparing negative to negative. I don't mean that, but I'm really looking at the diversity of different kinds of families. And I think that, you know, we know that, you know, lots and lots and lots of children are growing up in homes, for example, without dads. That lots and lots of children are growing up in single-parent homes. And I think that when we start to look at that diversity and we take it out of the gay issue, that'll be a lot easier for the clients to start to see some of how they're creating that negativity. And then I think we can also start looking at some of the positive things. You know, I've always been a person that hates this idea when people say, you know, why would people choose to be gay? I mean, why would anybody choose to be gay? And I think there's a lot of really cool reasons to choose to be gay. I think being gay is just a really phenomenal thing. So to help people to really understand some of the strengths that we bring to our families. And, you know, research has shown that. Research shows that that gay and lesbian families not only do as well as heterosexual families across every kind of issue, whether we're talking about how our kids are doing in school or how they're doing socially or how they're doing cognitively, but in many areas our families are actually doing better. And I suspect that when we start to break some of that research down and we start looking at why that might be, the key is about communication. Is because we have had to think more about all these kind of questions. We've had to plan more carefully than most heterosexual couples do. That we have a way of communicating with one another if we're in a couple and with our children to help them understand things about their lives that a lot of families never talk about those kinds of things.
Okay, and in addition to that, stretching that a little bit, they want to hear about how to tell kids how they can explain this.
How to talk directly to the child?
Yes.
Kind of think I've been talking about that.
Wait, no, I'm sorry, telling the kids how they can explain it to the outside.
How kids can talk more to people on the outside.
Yes.
Well, the part where that gets a little confusing to talk about is because each of our families are very different. So I don't know, with the sort of Venn diagram that I created, I don't know how to come up with an answer that may be good if you're a single dad. That's not going to work at all if you're in a different kind of family. So one of the things that I would say is that what I've learned with my children, and this is really more of a mommy statement than a therapist statement, but is that very simple answers is what works the best, and that kids feel very armed, if you'll excuse my military analogy there, but they feel very armed when they have answers. And I often share a story that my kid was very upset for about 3 days and didn't want to go to camp, and I couldn't figure out why, and then finally said to me that some kid at camp had said to him, "How come you like to do art when the other kids like to do sports?" Now that doesn't have anything to do with your origins, but it was this question that sort of was challenging his masculinity, although of course he didn't know that at 6 years old, but I interpreted that. And I said to him, "Well, why don't you just tell that little boy that you like art?" Kind of pretty lame answer. And he looked at me like it was like, "Wow, Mom, thank you so much." So I think, by way of analogy, that we can use that, if somebody says to you, "How come you have two dads?" The answer is because, my parents really, really wanted to have a child, and they decided to have a child through surrogacy, or they decided to adopt a child, and because they really wanted me. So the question becomes more about wanting you than how did two men have a child. So that you're instilling language into the child that is simple and direct. And I also remember one time when somebody asked my son something about adoption, and the answer he gave was, "That is not really something I want to talk about." And that's a perfectly fine answer too. So it's sort of almost like a multiple choice. You can tell people that you don't want to talk about that if you don't want to. You can tell people that you have two moms who really, really love you. You can tell people that your moms had a child with a friend of theirs who you call your uncle, and again, some of this is developmental. I wouldn't suggest that last one to a 5-year-old because that's too confusing. But as children get older, you want to both teach them that this is their story that they can tell in any way that they want, and also give them the language. Give them the language biological parent. Give them the language adoption. Give them the language I was in foster care and then I was adopted. So you want to help them form those kinds of words.
Can you talk a bit more about parent identifiers that might be non-traditional? For instance, a gender variant parent that the outside world might see as mom or dad but identifies as the opposite.
Okay, again, complicated. So are we talking about somebody who has transitioned and nobody knows that? Or we're talking about somebody who has not transitioned at all and nobody knows that? I don't know if that made sense, but in other words, there's a difference between my daddy identifies as a woman but isn't living as a woman yet. So I have this information but nobody else can see it, is different than my daddy used to be my mommy. So those are different kinds of questions. But again, I find that, if you can get clarification while I'm talking, please do. But I find that the most important thing for children is to have language and words to describe what is going on in their lives. And that we can give them the words that make the most sense in our family, depending on the configuration and the issues that are happening in our family, that we give them the language and the words that make sense to us. You talk about it with the child. And, to say to the kid, do you feel comfortable saying this? Do you feel comfortable saying that? What do you want your friends to know? Have your friends ever said anything to you about daddy? Have your friends ever said anything to you about how mommy looks? Have they questioned, the name? They asked you why. Sometimes when a parent will transition, their name will change. So they go from being, daddy to being Maddie in the family, or using a first name all of a sudden. So sometimes kids will ask questions about that. And again, you want to help them develop the simplest answer that will be useful, and you want to practice using that with them. So almost like a role play that's not set up as a role play, but that's, and how would you tell your friend that? And, have you told your friend yet about that daddy's going to be Maddie now? And if you help the kids hone their language for that, pretty much they'll do okay on their own.
And I did get clarification. It is not transition genderqueer.
Okay, so if the presentation is genderqueer, and again that's a large scope, but if the presentation is such that where most people in the world are walking around in fairly clear male-female bodies and designations, and it's very clear to all the kids on the playground who's the mommy and who's the daddy, and here's this parent who may be a little harder to read or a little harder to understand. And again, this stuff is really confusing for little kids because they live in a very simple world. A friend of mine who is definitely female, looks female. I mean, I don't think any of the grown-ups, saw her, would question that she was female. But being Italian, has a kind of thick mustache and a little bit of fuzz on the side of her cheeks. And she was teaching in a school system, and the kid came up to her and said, you're not really a girl because you have a beard and a mustache. And so kids live in very simple worlds around gender. So they're generally not challenging your family. And I think that's an important message for the kid. In other words, they're not saying that's not really your daddy, or who is that person. What they're doing is trying to say, how does that person fit into a box? And these are the only two boxes that are available. I have a blue box, I have a pink box, and I don't know who that person is standing over there by the side of the schoolyard, but they're not fitting into my world. And then the work becomes, giving them a new box. So I don't know how this person who identifies as genderqueer, how you see yourself, but whatever words you would use to the best of your ability, and I think all of our identities are sometimes a little hard to put into any kind of box, but to do our best to say this is how it is. So, in my family, my partner, my lesbian partner, is butch identified, and over the many years that we've been parenting, the kids are sometimes like, my mommy is more like a dad. Actually, my son went up to his first grade teacher and said to her, I just want you to know that in my family, my mommy sometimes does a lot of daddy type of things. I hope that's okay with you. And the teacher, at which point, said that was just fine with her, which I guess was better than if she said it wasn't fine with her. But so to put that into some kind of term, all of a sudden it became at a certain age, how come mommy always wears men's clothes? So at some point that was a realization that only one mommy wore lipstick and the other mommy never wore lipstick. And why was that? And trying to give them new terms and new boxes to put that in, and always falling back on that people have a right to express themselves, that this is the way I feel the most comfortable, this is the way that I can express myself best, and to sort of, if you will, break down that gender binary, not probably using those words with little kids, but that, some people are kind of like boys and girls. I think in Diane Arensaf's work of working with gender variant children, one of the little kids in her study said, I'm a boy on the outside and a girl on the inside. So, little kids, even though these are kind of deep concepts, even for us as adults, for little kids, they kind of get it in very simple ways of kind of describing it. I'm kind of a girl who likes to wear boys' clothes. Oh, okay, like that's a new subject header. That's a new chapter in the book I didn't know. And kids' lives are all about new chapters. Every day you're learning new things about the world that you just didn't know was like that. I often share the story that my son was 6 when I was writing my book, Transgender Emergence, and he walked into the room and said, you know, what is that? You know, what is this book that you're writing? And I said, I'm writing a book about transgender. And he said, what is that? And I said, well, transgender is when a boy kind of feels more like a girl, or a girl feels more like a boy. And sometimes people decide they want to live in the opposite sex of what they were born. And he looked at me and said, really? I didn't know you could do that. And I said, well, honey, you can. And he said, that's really good to know. What's for dinner? And I think that that is how it is for kids. So again, we're giving them that language. So the question for you is, what is it you want your kid to know, and how do you want to arm them to explain that to other kids?
Okay, the next question is, could or should a male donor have a relationship to the bio child in a same-sex family?
Should they? I certainly wouldn't step into that one. They certainly can. What that would depend upon is the parents who had that child and what their intentions are in that. So again, if a lesbian couple uses a donor with the intention that that donor is a donor, then I would say that donor should probably stay a donor unless something significantly changes in that family. Now, sometimes what happens is that people choose that the donor identifies as an uncle to the family, and that's the relationship. I know a lot of families that the kids know who their donor is, that the donor is a close friend of the family that might be partnered or married to somebody else, and that the other person has kids, and the kids are raised as kind of cousins to one another. I think the important thing is that there is no right or wrong, that the question is how do you want your family to look, is I think the first question. And the second question, as the child grows, is the child needing something different than what your initial intentions were? So you may have a very closed adoption until your kid is saying, I need to know more about my biological family, and you may need to relook at how you're doing your family. But the question is not, is it okay? I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but, it's okay to do our families any damn way we want, as long as we're open to the idea that once our kids are verbal, they may have different opinions about that.
Okay, here's the next one. When is a good time to come out as a trans-identified parent, female to male?
The younger that your children are when you come out, the better it is. Because again, little children don't have rules about sex and gender. They don't know that people can't or don't change sex. If you actually think about it, in the world of cartoons, people are constantly in children's books, they're constantly transforming from one thing to another. That's the nature of children's fantasy world. So this is not shocking to them. The older kids are, the more they become rigidified into the rules of the world. At certain developmental stages, those rules become very rigid and hard. Kids don't want to be different. They don't want to look different. They don't want anyone to see them different. They want to fit in. And as kids start getting older and developing their own sex and gender identities, they're very threatened by a parent's quote-unquote sex change, because it raises questions for them. What about me? Am I like you? Am I going to be like you? I don't like my body either, because of course what teen does like their body. And does this mean that I'm transgender too? So all kinds of questions come up for them, and again, kids at that age are not particularly thoughtful or self-reflective, so they react to those questions in a intense way of pushing you and the question away as far as they can. Boys especially in their teenage years have a really, really hard time with transitioning parent, and particularly a transitioning father. So really the sooner that we can talk about these ideas, and the simpler the terminology that we can use, daddy's not happy living as a boy and he wants to live as a girl. And it's also really important in there to remind the child that this has nothing to do with them, especially for a boy child, right? I mean, if I'm a man and I'm not happy and I want to be a woman, the little boy may be thinking, do you not like me because I'm a boy too? So you want to be really careful about how children are interpreting that information.
Okay, I think we have time for just one last question.
Okay.
When should straight cisgender parents start talking to their biological, naturally conceived children about the diversity and how children come to their families to instill accepting attitudes but not confuse them?
Okay, so if I understood that correctly, this was cisgender. Was this heterosexual and cisgender parents? Did I hear that right?
Yes, yep.
Okay. So in other words, the average American family, more or less, how do we talk to our kids about diversity? And again, I think you start doing that as young as you can. That children should be introduced to the idea as young as we can that all families are different. And parents should point out all kinds of differences in how families look and how families are, and noticing, look at that kid with his grandparents, and look at, did you notice that, Oscar has a brother who's 10 years older than him, and, look at that family, those are two dads over there, as soon as we're able to. And again, if for whatever reason that is not evident in your immediate social surroundings, for whatever reason, there's lots of good books that show diversity. So, I'm kind of a bibliophile, and my kids have books on every subject in the world. But, we spent a lot of time talking about how kids in different parts of the world live. I wanted them to have that knowledge of families that were not just like us. So not just Jewish families, but Muslim families and Christian families and pagan families. I wanted them to have as much information about diversity as possible. And I really do believe that raising children with that kind of awareness and understanding, what Maria Montessori, talked about, citizens of the world, that they begin to understand, and they're not going to have as their primary construct a heteronormative construct. They're not going to assume that parents are males and females, that every family looks like that, if we don't give them that information in the beginning.
Hi everyone, this is Claudia Stallman. It's 7:59, which means that our jam-packed hour-and-a-half long webinar is coming to a close. I want to thank Ari for sharing so much wonderful and helpful information. Thank Heather Hauer-Ross for doing a great job of administering this webinar thing. I'm still getting used to it. And thank folks for their wonderful questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. We will do, I do want to let you know that the webinar will be archived at our website, prideandjoyfamilies.org. And I'm going to ask you all to please stay on and take a short evaluation survey once the session closes. Again, thanks to everyone, especially Ari, for a terrific presentation.
Thank you, Claudia. And I just want to show everybody that my website is there and my email address is on the screen. So you're welcome to use those as appropriate to contact me. That's my cute family there, too.
They are a cute family. Thanks again, everybody, and have a good night.
Thanks.